The courtroom fell silent as Detective Marcus Webb took the stand, his uniform pressed sharp enough to cut glass. 4 years on the force. Spotless record. A commendation for bravery. He was testifying against one of his own, Officer James Kellen, accused of planting evidence at a crime scene that sent an innocent man to prison for 18 months. Marcus didn't want to be here. Nobody did. The department was bleeding credibility, and this trial was the wound that wouldn't close. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, his jaw tightening as he did. The irony wasn't lost on him. Truth. As if truth had ever been simple in a police department where loyalty was supposed to trump everything else, even conscience. The prosecution's attorney, Patricia Holloway, approached with measured steps. She was a woman in her mid-50s with steel-gray eyes and a reputation for destroying corrupt cops. She'd taken down 3 officers in the past 5 years, and now she was coming for another. "Detective Webb," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the courthouse. "You were present at the evidence recovery on March 14th of this year. Is that correct?" "Yes," Marcus replied. His voice was steady, but his hands told a different story. They were gripping the edge of the witness stand so hard his knuckles had gone white. "And you witnessed Officer Kellen retrieve what was documented as a .38 caliber handgun from the suspect's residence." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. Once he said the words, there was no taking them back, no going back to the way things were. "No," he said quietly, "I witnessed Officer Kellen plant that handgun." A ripple went through the courtroom. Gasps. The sound of a pen dropping. Officer Kellen's lawyer immediately stood, but the judge held up a hand, silencing the objection before it could begin. Marcus continued, the words pouring out now like a confession. "We were searching the living room. The suspect wasn't home. It was just me, Kellen, and Officer Martinez. We'd been there for 40 minutes, finding nothing. The case was weak. Everyone knew it. But Kellen was frustrated. He said something like, 'We need to tie this up.'" The courtroom was so quiet Marcus could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. "I saw him reach into his jacket pocket," Marcus said. "He pulled out a gun, a .38. I recognized it because it was the same model as the one registered to him. He was trying to be subtle about it, but I was watching. I saw him place it beneath the floorboard in the corner, near the bookshelf. Then he called me over and told me to photograph it in place. He said we'd found it hidden there." Officer Kellen's face had gone sheet white. His lawyer was whispering frantically in his ear, but Kellen wasn't responding. He was staring at Marcus with something between shock and betrayal. "Why didn't you report this immediately?" Holloway asked. Marcus felt the weight of that question like a physical force crushing his chest. "Because I was afraid," he said simply. "Because he was a senior officer and I was new. Because the case was against a guy with a record, and I told myself that maybe he was guilty anyway. Maybe the gun didn't matter, because I was a coward." His voice cracked on that last word. In the gallery, Sarah Mitchell stirred. She'd been sitting quietly, trying to keep Emma occupied with a coloring book, but something about the detective's raw admission had caught her attention. She looked up at the stand, studying Marcus Webb's face. This was a man breaking himself open in real time, and she found herself respecting him for it, even as she felt sad for him. Emma, bored with the coloring book, had given up 15 minutes earlier and was now curled against Sarah's side, drifting in and out of sleep. Her thumb had found its way into her mouth, a habit Sarah had been trying to break for months, but which Emma always returned to when she was tired or anxious. The trial continued for another hour. Marcus described the investigation that followed, how he tried to ignore what he'd seen for months, how it ate at him, how he'd started drinking more, sleeping less, how he'd finally gone to the Internal Affairs Division, terrified they'd think he was crazy or that he'd become a pariah in the department. He was right about the pariah part. Since he'd reported Kellen, Marcus had become a ghost in the precinct. His locker had been vandalized. His coffee had been tampered with. Anonymous complaints had been filed against him. Officers who'd been friendly suddenly wouldn't look at him. His lieutenant had suggested he take administrative leave until this whole thing blows over. But Marcus couldn't let it blow over. Not when he knew that an innocent man was rotting in a cell because of planted evidence. Not when he knew that Kellen was still out there, still able to plant evidence, still able to ruin lives. So he'd stayed the course, and now he was testifying, and his career in law enforcement was effectively over because no department would touch him after this. Other officers would see him as a rat, a betrayer, someone who couldn't be trusted. The defense attorney cross-examined Marcus for 2 hours, trying to poke holes in his story, suggesting memory issues, suggesting bias, suggesting that Marcus had a vendetta against Kellen. But Marcus's story didn't change. Not a single detail varied. Not because he was coached, because he was telling the truth, and the truth has a consistency that lies can't replicate. By the time Marcus was dismissed from the stand, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his face looked 10 years older than it had when he'd first sat down. In the gallery, Sarah was watching him intently now. Emma had fully fallen asleep against her shoulder, her small body warm and trusting. Sarah found herself thinking about courage, about what it cost, about why some people could find it when others couldn't. The judge called for a recess. People stood, stretching, chatting quietly. The courtroom began to empty. Some spectators had cases to get back to. Some were journalists rushing to file stories. Some were just regular people who'd been curious enough to attend a trial about police corruption. Sarah stood carefully, trying not to wake Emma. She gathered the coloring book and crayons, preparing to carry her daughter out to the hallway so she could stretch her legs during the break. As she stood, Emma's eyes fluttered open, groggy, confused, the way toddlers are when they're yanked from sleep. She blinked a few times, trying to remember where she was. Sarah bent down slightly, letting Emma rest her head on her shoulder again as they made their way toward the aisle. That's when Emma looked toward the front of the courtroom, toward the K-9 unit officer who'd been sitting in the gallery and was now standing to retrieve the German Shepherd that had been brought as evidence in the case. The dog, a beautiful black and tan named Kaiser, was resting on a padded mat near the witness stand, his handler moving toward him with a water bowl. Kaiser's ears perked up at the sound of his handler's approach, his tail thumping once against the mat. But Emma's reaction was nothing like the gentle interest of a sleepy toddler seeing a pretty dog. Emma's entire body went rigid. Every muscle seemed to lock at once. Her thumb fell from her mouth. Her eyes, suddenly very wide, fixed on something across the courtroom but not on the dog. "Mommy," Emma whispered, and her voice had changed. It was smaller, frightened, the voice of a child who'd seen something that terrified her on a primal level. Sarah looked down, confused. "What is it, baby?" "Mommy," Emma said again, louder this time, her voice trembling with an intensity that made Sarah's maternal instincts scream. Emma pointed, that distinctive toddler point where the whole arm extends, the small finger shaking. But Emma wasn't pointing at the dog. She was pointing at Officer James Kellen, the man currently on trial for planting evidence, the man sitting at the defense table, the man Sarah had never seen before in her life, and whose existence in any context would have meant nothing to her daughter. Yet Emma was pointing at him with the kind of terror that transcends age, that belongs to something primal and broken inside a small child. Officer Kellen had stood up along with everyone else, and for just a fraction of a second, before his mask slipped back into place, his expression had shifted. His eyes, which had been cold and composed throughout the trial, suddenly went wide. His face went pale. His mouth opened slightly as if he'd been struck. He was staring directly at Emma. And in that moment, Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold: recognition. Not the casual recognition of someone remembering a face. This was something deeper, something that made Kellen look like he'd seen a ghost, like Emma's small figure had just brought all his carefully constructed world crashing down around him. His lawyer, noticing his sudden reaction, grabbed his arm and whispered something urgent. Kellen sat back down mechanically, but his hands were shaking. His eyes, though he forced himself to look forward, kept drifting back to Emma. Sarah held her daughter tighter, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. "That man," Emma whispered against her mother's shoulder. That man scared me." And Sarah understood in that moment that her daughter had just witnessed something that would change all of their lives forever. Sarah's heart began to hammer in her chest with an intensity that made her feel like she might pass out right there in the middle of the courthouse hallway. She'd never seen Officer Kellen before this trial. She didn't know him. There was no earthly reason why Emma would have any connection to this man. Yet her daughter was trembling. Emma tugged at Sarah's sleeve with both small fists, her face buried in her mother's shoulder. "That man," she whispered again. "That man scared me. That man scared me." The repetition, the way Emma kept saying it, like a loop her brain couldn't break free from, terrified Sarah more than anything else could have. This wasn't Emma being curious about a stranger. This wasn't Emma being overstimulated by the courtroom. This was Emma experiencing something visceral and primal. "When baby?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady even as her mind raced through possibilities. "When did you see him?" Emma lifted her head, her eyes glassy with tears that hadn't yet started falling. "Dark place," she whispered. "Dark, dark place. And he was there. And another man was there too." Sarah's blood went cold. The other man, the vague reference, the incomplete memory that Sarah's brain couldn't quite grasp. "Can you tell Mommy more about the dark place?" Sarah asked gently, though her hands were now shaking. "Where was it, sweetie?" Emma's lower lip trembled. She shook her head, unable to find words. She was 4 years old, still at an age where emotions often outpaced vocabulary. Sarah could see her daughter struggling to articulate something that felt too big, too scary, too much for such a small voice. Before Sarah could press further, the bailiff's voice echoed through the hallway. "All rise. The court is reconvening." Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to grab the bailiff and demand that they wait, that Emma had something to say, that there was something important happening that had nothing to do with the case being tried and everything to do with a child's terror. But the courtroom had other priorities. Sarah carried Emma back into the courtroom, her daughter clinging to her like a lifeline. She sat back in her seat, the same seat she'd occupied for 3 days of testimony, but nothing was the same anymore. Sarah's entire world had shifted on its axis. 3 months ago, Sarah had taken Emma to the police station on a Tuesday afternoon, a routine thing, one of those community police partnerships that had been all the rage lately. The precinct had organized a community awareness event in partnership with Emma's daycare. It was supposed to build positive relationships between children and law enforcement. Let them see the K-9 unit, pet a dog, learn about safety. Sarah had thought it was a good idea at the time. The event had been in the main lobby of the police station, officers in uniform, smiling and friendly. The K-9 unit had been there, the same German shepherds that had become part of the department's identity. Parents and children had mingled for about an hour. Emma had been excited. She'd always loved dogs, and she'd gotten to pet Kaiser, who'd seemed gentle and patient with the children. Sarah had taken some photos. She'd spoken with a few other parents, and then she'd needed to use the bathroom. It was a 5-minute thing, maybe less. Sarah had asked one of the officers to keep an eye on Emma, and the officer, a friendly-looking young man, had nodded and said he'd make sure Emma was fine. Sarah had rushed to the bathroom, taken care of business, washed her hands, and returned. The entire round trip had taken maybe 7 or 8 minutes. When she'd returned to the lobby, Emma had been standing with that same young officer near a back hallway. A hallway that definitely wasn't part of the public tour. a hallway that led toward the administrative offices and the holding cells. Sarah remembered being confused. She'd asked what they were doing back there, and the officer had smiled and said that Emma had been curious about the police station, that she'd wandered back toward the hallway, and that he'd figured he'd show her around a bit. He'd kept it brief, he'd said. Just wanted to let her see what a real police station looked like. He'd smiled the whole time. Sarah had smiled back, though something in her gut had felt slightly off. But the officer's demeanor had been so casual, so normal, that she decided she was being paranoid. He was just being nice. He was just engaging with a child from the community. There was nothing wrong with that. Except Emma wasn't fine after that. For weeks afterward, Emma had developed a fear of uniforms. She'd cling to Sarah whenever they passed a police car. She'd have nightmares. Sarah would wake to her daughter screaming about the dark place and the man. She'd regressed in her potty training, having accidents at night for the first time in months despite being fully daytime trained for over a year. Sarah had taken her to the pediatrician, worried something was physically wrong. The doctor had done a thorough examination and found nothing medically amiss. He'd suggested it was probably just stress. Sarah had recently gotten divorced. Maybe Emma was picking up on that anxiety. Maybe it was a phase. Kids went through phases. Give her some time, the pediatrician had said, in that tone that suggested Sarah was being an overprotective mother. She'll come out of it. Sarah had wanted to believe that. She'd wanted to believe that her daughter's nightmares and fear were just a response to her parents' divorce, something normal and understandable and eventually passable. Except they hadn't passed. Emma had gotten slightly better over the past 3 months. The nightmares had become less frequent. The fear of uniforms had diminished. But there were still nights when Emma would wake up crying about the dark place. There were still moments when Emma would see a police officer and her whole body would tense. Sarah had attributed it to lingering stress. She'd bought Emma a nightlight. She'd read extra bedtime stories. She'd been more attentive, more patient, more present. But what if it wasn't stress? What if something had actually happened? Now, sitting in the courtroom watching Officer Kellen testify about his innocence, or rather, watching his lawyer argue his innocence while Kellen sat stone-faced, Sarah couldn't stop her mind from racing through terrible possibilities. That officer who'd shown Emma around, what did he look like? Sarah tried to pull the memory into focus, but it was frustratingly fuzzy. 3 months had passed. She'd only seen him for a few minutes. He'd seemed nice, which meant her brain had probably archived the memory as unthreatening and moved on. But now she needed to remember. She closed her eyes and visualized that day. The lobby, the dogs, the other parents, and then the hallway, the young officer, brown hair, she thought so, tall, yes, taller than average. She was trying to remember his face, but it kept slipping away from her mental grasp like a fish in water. What she could remember with perfect clarity was the feeling that something was off, that gut instinct she dismissed. And she could remember, with even more terrible clarity, the way Emma's behavior had changed after that day. During the next recess, mercifully called within another hour, Sarah found herself standing in the courthouse hallway, staring at her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She needed to talk to someone who understood, someone who believed her. She scrolled through the contacts in her phone. Most of them were friends from her marriage, people she'd slowly lost touch with during the divorce. Her ex-husband who'd moved to Phoenix, her sister who was in Colorado. And then she saw it, Detective Marcus Webb. He'd given her his card after testifying. She'd kept it without really thinking about why. Maybe she'd known on some instinctual level that she might need it. Emma was playing with a toy in the hallway, a small doll that Sarah had brought to keep her entertained. The courtroom was emptying as people scattered for the recess. Sarah found a quiet corner, away from the flow of foot traffic, and made the call. Detective Webb answered on the second ring. His voice was cautious when he picked up, Clearly, he'd gotten a lot of calls from strangers since his testimony started going public. "Detective Webb, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I was in the courtroom today. I think I know something about Officer Kellen, something involving my daughter." There was a pause, a long one. Sarah could almost hear the wheels turning in the detective's mind, the sudden realization that this wasn't a crank call, that this was something serious. "Where are you right now?" Webb asked, his voice changing. It was no longer cautious. It was sharp, alert, a detective's voice. "The courthouse, in the hallway with my daughter." "Stay there, don't leave, don't talk to anyone else. I'm coming to you right now. Do not move until I get there." Sarah hung up, and she pulled Emma close. Her daughter looked up at her with confused eyes. "Mommy, are we leaving?" "No, baby," Sarah said. "We're waiting for Detective Webb, the man from the trial. He's going to help us figure something out." Emma seemed to accept this, though her small body remained tense against her mother's side. And as they sat there in the hallway of the courthouse, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about that day at the police station, about the officer with the brown hair and the friendly smile, about the dark hallway, about the way Emma's entire personality had shifted after that afternoon, about the terrifying possibility that something had happened to her daughter in that dark place. And worse, the possibility that Officer Kellen had been there, had witnessed it, had known. The realization hit her like a physical blow. What if the trial wasn't about police corruption and planted evidence at all? What if it was about something far darker, far more sinister, far more evil than anyone in that courtroom realized? Detective Marcus Webb found Sarah and Emma in a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway, away from the main flow of traffic. He was a big man, 6'2", with shoulders broad enough to seem both protective and intimidating depending on the angle. His kind eyes, however, were what made people trust him. Those eyes had seen terrible things, and yet they still held compassion. He knelt down so he was at eye level with Emma, his massive frame making the simple action seem almost vulnerable. "Hi there, sweetheart," he said gently, his voice pitched low and soft. "I'm Detective Marcus. What's your name?" Emma studied him for a long moment. She was usually shy with strangers, especially men in any kind of official capacity. But something in Webb's demeanor, the way he'd made himself smaller, the way he'd made himself non-threatening, seemed to register with her. "Emma," she whispered, and immediately buried her face in Sarah's neck, her small arms wrapping around her mother's shoulders. Webb stood and nodded at Sarah, a gesture that said, "I understand. Let's talk somewhere private." He led them to a private consultation room, the kind that attorneys used to meet with clients before trials. It was small but comfortable, with soft lighting and chairs arranged in a way that didn't feel adversarial. Webb closed the door behind them and gestured for Sarah to sit. Emma climbed into her mother's lap, her thumb finding its way into her mouth, a regressive behavior that Sarah had noticed increasing over the past 3 months. The stress of this moment, the fear radiating from her mother, was pulling Emma back into more infantile comfort mechanisms. "Tell me everything," Webb said, pulling out a small notebook. Not the kind of notebook that would be entered into evidence or used in trial, just a personal one for his own reference. "Start with the beginning. I need context." Sarah's voice shook as she recounted the community event 3 months ago, the police station visit, the bathroom break, coming back to find Emma with an officer in a back hallway, the vague explanation about showing Emma around, and most crucially, the behavioral changes that had followed. Webb's expression grew darker with each detail. "The officer who was with Emma," he said carefully, "can you describe him?" Sarah closed her eyes, trying to pull the memory into focus with the intensity of will alone. "Younger, maybe late 20s, brown hair, I think, tall, definitely taller than average. He seemed friendly at the time. He said his name was—" She trailed off, frustration mounting. "I can't remember. He seemed so normal that my brain just filed him away as unremarkable." Officer David Chen is 32, Webb said quietly. But he wasn't assigned to community liaison duties 3 months ago. He was. Actually, let me check the roster. He pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking quietly to someone on the other end. After 3 minutes, he hung up. Officer Tyler Morrison, Webb said, 28 years old, brown hair, listed as 6'1". He was assigned to the Community Liaison Program at that exact time. He volunteered for those kinds of events specifically. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The name meant nothing to her, but the fact that Webb could identify him based on her vague description, that meant something. That meant this had happened before. That meant there might be patterns. What happens now? Sarah asked. Webb took a deep breath. We need to interview Emma, but I need to do this right. If what you're suggesting is true, if Officer Morrison did something to Emma, then we need her statement to be absolutely solid. We need it to hold up in court, which means we need it to be collected by someone who specializes in interviewing children. No leading questions. Just letting Emma tell her story in her own words. How long will that take? Sarah asked. A few hours, probably, but it's crucial. A child's testimony in cases like this, if she's been coached or if the questions are leading in any way, the defense will tear it apart. We need to do this perfectly. Webb made another call, this one to a forensic interviewer he knew, Dr. Patricia Chen, who had 20 years of experience working with traumatized children. She agreed to meet them at a specialized interview facility across town, one that was set up specifically for these kinds of sensitive conversations. Sarah made the decision to keep Emma out of school for the rest of the day. She texted her ex-husband, Mark, to let him know there was a situation and that she might need him to pick up Emma the following day if things went sideways. He called her back immediately, worried, but Sarah didn't have the energy to explain over the phone. 2 hours later, they were in a small room designed to be as non-threatening as possible. Soft lighting, colorful walls, toys scattered strategically around, a comfortable chair for Emma, and a one-way mirror where Sarah, Webb, and a court-appointed observer could watch without Emma being aware of their presence. Dr. Patricia Chen was a woman in her early 60s with gray streaks in her dark hair, and the kind of gentle presence that immediately put children at ease. She was dressed casually, jeans and a soft sweater, deliberately avoiding the appearance of authority or officiousness. "Hi, Emma," Patricia said, sitting down beside the child. "My name is Dr. Chen. I'm going to talk with you about some stuff, okay? And there's no pressure. If you want to take a break, we can take a break. If you want to talk about something else, we can do that too. This is your time." Emma nodded slowly, still clutching her mother's hand. But Sarah had to step behind the mirror for the interview to proceed properly. The child needed to feel safe without her mother's presence becoming a distraction. Sarah watched her daughter through the one-way glass as Patricia began with easy, open-ended questions. What was Emma's favorite toy? Did she like school? What did she like to play? Gradually, Patricia steered the conversation toward the police station visit. "Emma, do you remember going to the police station with your mommy?" Patricia asked, her voice remaining light and conversational, as if they were just chatting about the weather. Emma nodded. There were puppies, dogs, they were nice. "Yeah, dogs are cool," Patricia agreed. "Did you have fun with the dogs?" "Yes," Emma said, "but then a man took me somewhere." Patricia's body language didn't change, but Sarah could see the subtle shift in her attention. "Tell me about that man." "He was nice at first," Emma said. "He said there were more puppies somewhere. He said he would show me." "And did you go with him?" "Yeah, he took me through a locked door, and it was dark." Behind the glass, Sarah felt her knees weaken. Webb caught her elbow, steadying her. "It was dark," Patricia repeated, not asking a question, just reflecting back what Emma had said to encourage her to continue. "What happened in the dark place?" Emma's small hands were trembling now. Her thumb had found its way back into her mouth, and she was curling into herself slightly, becoming smaller. He said, Emma's voice was barely a whisper. He said there were puppies down there, but there weren't any puppies, and he touched me in my private place. He said it was a game, but it didn't feel like a game. It felt bad. I felt bad inside. Patricia's jaw tightened, but her voice remained gentle and level. Emma, that was a secret he told you to keep. He said if I told Mommy, the puppies would go away, and he said. Emma paused, gathering courage for the next part. He said he would know. He said he would always know. He said he could see me even when I wasn't there, that he could see me at home. Sarah had to grip the edge of the counter to keep herself upright. The threat, the classic predatory tactic, making the child believe they had omniscient surveillance capabilities, making them too afraid to tell anyone. Patricia asked a few more careful questions, establishing timeline and details, but not pushing too hard. Emma was becoming increasingly agitated, her breathing more rapid, her body language more withdrawn. Emma, I want to ask you about something, Patricia said carefully. You know that man we saw in the big room today, the trial room, with all the people? Emma's entire body went rigid. Her eyes, which had been unfocused as she talked about her trauma, suddenly snapped into sharp focus. Was the man who touched you in the dark place the same man you saw in that room today? Emma's head moved slowly side to side. No, she said. That wasn't the same man, but... But what? Patricia prompted gently. The tall man in the big room. He was there in the dark place. He watched and didn't stop it. Behind the glass, Webb closed his eyes. Oh God, Sarah whispered. Oh my God. The implications crashed over them like a wave. Not just one officer, not just Morrison. Officer James Kellen, the man currently on trial for planting evidence, the man currently trying to maintain his innocence. He'd been present. He'd witnessed the abuse of a 4-year-old child and had done nothing. Or worse, had actively participated in covering it up by using a threat of his own. Patricia continued the interview for another 30 minutes, carefully documenting every detail Emma could remember. What the dark place looked like, what the man who touched her had said, how the tall man, Kellen, had looked at her, the feelings she'd experienced, the fear that had stayed with her for 3 months. When it was finished, Patricia excused herself and came around to the observation room. Her professional expression was grim. That's a clear disclosure of child sexual abuse, she said quietly. The details are consistent with what we typically see in these cases. The threat about telling her mother, the manipulation about the puppies, the claim of omniscience. These are textbook grooming and abuse tactics. Webb was already on his phone. I need to call the DA, he said. Right now. Patricia Holloway needs to know what we've just learned. As he made the call, Sarah pressed her hand against the one-way mirror, watching her daughter through the glass. Emma was sitting with Dr. Chen, coloring a picture, her small face still tense but gradually relaxing as she moved into a more calming activity. Sarah's daughter, her sweet, innocent daughter, violated by a man in a police uniform, threatened into silence, and witnessed, allowed to be victimized by another officer of the law. Sarah had spent 3 months believing Emma's trauma was a response to the divorce. 3 months of guilt over not protecting her daughter from emotional distress, when all along Emma had been carrying the weight of actual, horrific abuse. We have him, Webb whispered as he hung up the phone. The DA is calling an emergency meeting with the judge. We have him. But even as he said it, Sarah understood that they didn't have everyone. There was still Officer Morrison, the man who'd done the actual abusing, who'd lured Emma with lies about puppies, who'd violated her in a dark room beneath a police station. And there was still the question that haunted her. What had made Kellen choose to watch instead of intervening? Was he complicit? Was he part of something larger? Was Morrison his partner in this? Or was Kellen simply a coward who'd prioritized his career over a child's safety? The truth was about to unravel, but only if Emma remained brave enough to tell it. The implications crashed over Detective Marcus Webb like a tsunami. Not just Kellen covering up his own crime of planting evidence. Someone else. Someone Kellen had protected. Someone who had leverage over Kellen, or worse, someone Kellen was complicit with in ways that went far deeper than anyone had realized. Webb's mind was racing through connections, through patterns, through the terrible architecture of corruption that seemed to extend in directions no one had anticipated when this trial began. He immediately pulled out his phone and called Patricia Holloway, the prosecutor. Her line went to voicemail. She was still in court, so he left an urgent message asking her to call him immediately. Then he called the courthouse and asked for an emergency recess. 20 minutes later, Patricia Holloway stood in a private conference room with Webb, Sarah, and the court-appointed child protection specialist. Webb had Dr. Chen's written notes in his hands, and as he read them aloud, he watched Patricia's face transform. Her expression began as skepticism. This was a bombshell claim that needed to be verified. But as Webb continued reading, the skepticism shifted to shock, and then to something darker. A prosecutor's realization that the case she'd been building was far larger and far more sinister than she'd understood. "We need to pause the trial," Patricia said immediately. "I'm calling a meeting with the judge, right now." "The defense will argue for a mistrial," Webb warned. "They'll say this is a prosecution tactic to introduce inadmissible evidence." "Let them argue," Patricia snapped. "What we have here is evidence of ongoing child abuse within the police department. That's not a trial tactic. That's criminal conspiracy. That's obstruction of justice. That's potentially accessory to felony child sexual abuse." She stood and left the room without another word. The next hour was a whirlwind of legal maneuvering. The judge was brought into chambers. The defense attorney was called in, his face going through a series of expressions as he was told what had transpired. Officer Kellen had to be informed. His lawyer demanded to know what this was about. Patricia Holloway explained, carefully and methodically, that new evidence had come to light. A child had disclosed sexual abuse perpetrated by an officer, with another officer present at the scene. The second officer, Kellen, had apparently done nothing to stop it. Officer Kellen stood up so suddenly his chair clattering backward echoed through the courtroom. "This is insane," he shouted. "I want a lawyer. I'm not saying another word without." "Sit down, officer," the judge commanded, his voice cutting through like a knife. "You're already in contempt." Kellen sat, but his hands were shaking visibly. His lawyer was whispering frantically in his ear, but Kellen wasn't responding. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, the face of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. The judge called for an emergency investigation. The trial was adjourned indefinitely, and Detective Webb was immediately reinstated as lead investigator, the very position he'd been removed from when he'd reported Kellen for planting evidence. Within hours, every surveillance camera in the police station from 3 months prior was being pulled and reviewed. Webb personally supervised the search, his jaw clenched so tight it felt like it might break. The tech team worked through the footage systematically. The main lobby where the community event had taken place, the hallways, the administrative areas, the basement. And then they found it. Grainy footage from a camera in the basement hallway near the holding cells. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m., the exact time Sarah had gone to the bathroom. A young officer with brown hair was leading a small blonde child by the hand. The child was Emma. There was no doubt about it. Sarah had brought photos of Emma to help with the identification, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The officer was leading her toward a storage room at the end of the hallway. The footage showed them entering the storage room. Then it showed the officer closing the door behind them. The timestamp on the footage continued, 2:48 p.m., 2:49 p.m., 2:50 p.m. Webb felt his stomach turning. Whatever had happened in that storage room, it had taken time. It hadn't been a quick, momentary lapse. It had been deliberate, premeditated. At 2:54 p.m., the officer and Emma emerged from the storage room. Emma's face was visible on the camera. She looked confused, frightened, withdrawn. The officer had his hand on her shoulder and he was leaning down, saying something to her that the camera couldn't pick up audio of. Webb knew what he was saying. He was making threats, establishing his omniscience, creating a cage of fear around a 4-year-old that would keep her silent for months. The officer's face was clear as day on the footage. His name tag was visible in some frames. Morrison. Officer Tyler Morrison, 28 years old, 3 years on the force. No prior complaints in his file. No red flags that anyone had noticed. But then the second piece of footage came in, taken from a camera in the administrative hallway on the ground floor. The timestamp was 3:09 p.m., about 15 minutes after Emma and Morrison had emerged from the storage room. Officer James Kellen was walking down that hallway. He passed the basement door. He slowed. He stopped. He looked around, checking to see if anyone was watching. Then, deliberately, he walked to the basement door and opened it. He descended the stairs. The camera didn't follow him beyond that point, but it didn't need to. Kellen knew he had to know. Why else would he go down there? The footage showed him returning to the basement 5 minutes later. He was empty-handed. He didn't appear to be carrying anything. His expression as he climbed the stairs and emerged back into the hallway was unreadable, but his movements were careful, deliberate, the movements of a man covering his tracks. Webb watched the footage 3 times in a row. Each time, the reality of what he was seeing became more concrete, more horrifying. Kellen had known about Morrison. Kellen had gone to the basement after the abuse had occurred. Had he been checking on Morrison, ensuring Morrison hadn't left evidence, or had he been delivering a message to Morrison about keeping quiet? Either way, Kellen's presence in that hallway at that moment was not coincidental. By evening, Officer David Chen, no relation to Dr. Patricia Chen, was arrested at his home. Webb and 2 other detectives arrived at his apartment with a warrant. Chen wasn't surprised to see them. He seemed almost relieved, as if the burden of his secrets had become too heavy to carry. "I want to make a deal," Chen said immediately, before they'd even finished reading him his rights. "That's not how this works," Webb said coldly. "You're under arrest for child sexual abuse, for contributing to the delinquency of a minor, for making terroristic threats, for—" "I know," Chen interrupted. "I know what I did and I know why I did it. I'll tell you everything, but I need protection and I need a deal because Kellen isn't the only one who knew. There are others." A search of Chen's apartment revealed a laptop with encrypted files. The IT team worked through the night to crack the encryption. What they found inside made even the hardened detectives feel physically ill. Photos, videos, documentation of abuse spanning back nearly 2 years. Not just Emma, other children, younger children, children from community events, from school tour, from anywhere Chen had access to them. There were at least 8 victims in the files that the team found, possibly more, and scattered throughout the documentation were references to other officers, names, dates, evidence of a network. A network of predators operating within the police department, using their authority, using their access, using the trust that the public placed in them. Officer Kellen's name appeared repeatedly in the files, not always as a perpetrator but as a protector, a man who'd witnessed crimes and chosen not to report them, a man who'd potentially obstructed investigations, a man who'd prioritized his career and his loyalty to other officers over the safety of children. By the time the sun rose the following morning, the police department was in freefall. Officer Chen had been arrested and was cooperating with investigators. Officer Morrison was arrested at his home, and Officer Kellen's case had transformed entirely. He was no longer just facing charges of planting evidence. He was now facing charges as an accessory to child sexual abuse, obstruction of justice, and potentially conspiracy. His lawyer immediately began negotiating a plea deal. Kellen wanted immunity on the sexual abuse charges in exchange for his testimony against the others, but Patricia Holloway refused. "He watched a 4-year-old being raped in a storage room and did nothing," she said flatly. "There is no deal that I would accept for that." Sarah, watching the news coverage from her living room with Emma asleep against her shoulder, felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice was happening. The system was actually working, at least in this case. But the cost was immeasurable. Emma would need years of therapy. The nightmares wouldn't disappear overnight. The fear wouldn't simply evaporate because the men who'd hurt her were now in custody. The violation would echo through her daughter's life in ways Sarah couldn't predict or prevent. But Emma was alive. Emma was safe. And because Emma had been brave enough to point, because Emma had been terrified enough to let her fear show, other children would be protected. Still, as Sarah held her daughter close and watched the news coverage of the expanding investigation, she couldn't escape the haunting question that would keep her awake through countless nights. What if Emma hadn't been in that courtroom that day? What if she'd stayed home with the daycare? How many more children would have suffered in that basement before someone finally stopped it? The interrogation room at the Detective Bureau was cold and clinical, a space designed to make criminals uncomfortable, to strip away pretense and force confessions through the weight of silence and fluorescent lights. Detective Marcus Webb sat across from Officer David Chen, with Chen's public defender beside him looking increasingly panicked as Chen, apparently deciding that cooperation was his only viable path forward, began laying out the architecture of his crimes. Chen was a man unraveling in real time. His hands shook as he spoke. His voice cracked. He looked like someone who'd been carrying a weight so heavy that its removal, even through confession, felt like a kind of mercy. "It started about 2 years ago," Chen said, his eyes fixed on the metal table between them. I had a problem. I've always had a problem, but I never acted on it until I got the opportunity." Webb's jaw clenched. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to understand Chen's psychology or his rationalizations or his excuses, but he needed the information. "Tell me about the first victim," Webb said quietly. Chen closed his eyes. "A girl, 7 years old, during a school tour of the station. I didn't plan it, it just happened. I saw her and I knew I could get her alone, and I did. And afterward I couldn't believe no one had stopped me. No one had noticed." "Did anyone see you?" "Officer Kellen," Chen said. "He came down to the basement about 20 minutes after. I don't know how he knew. Maybe he heard something. Maybe he was looking for me, but he found me and he just knew what I'd done." "And what did he do?" Chen looked up at Webb. "He asked me if she'd told anyone. I said no, and he said, 'Keep it that way, and don't let me catch you doing this again.' Then he left." Webb felt something cold settle in his chest. Kellen hadn't reported it, hadn't arrested Chen, hadn't even threatened him. He just acknowledged it. And in that acknowledgement he'd become complicit. "But I did it again," Chen continued, his voice barely audible. "I did it again, and each time Kellen found out, and each time he just told me the same thing, 'Keep it quiet, don't let this come back on me.'" "Why would he say that?" Webb asked. "Why would he mention himself?" Chen's eyes filled with tears. "Because there was something else, something that happened before me, something that Kellen did, and someone had evidence of it. Someone had leverage over him, and that person used that leverage to make Kellen protect me." Webb leaned forward. Who had leverage over Kellen?" "A detective," Chen said. "Internal affairs detective named Morrison." "Wait, no, that's the wrong Morrison. This was different. This was someone higher up. Someone with access to personnel files, with access to everything." The interrogation continued for hours. Chen detailed 4 other child victims, their ages, the dates of the abuse, the locations where it had occurred. He provided names of other officers who'd suspected something was wrong but had chosen to stay silent. He created a map of corruption that extended far beyond just Kellen and himself. But the revelation that shook Webb to his core came near the end. "There are videos," Chen said. "I made videos, not for distribution, just for personal use, but Kellen knew about them. And he made me promise that if I ever got caught, I wouldn't mention him directly in connection with the abuse, but I could mention him in connection with other things, other crimes, things that would distract from the real issue." "What other crimes?" Webb demanded. "I don't know the details," Chen said, but Kellen mentioned planting evidence on cases, skewing investigations, manipulating witnesses. He said if I ever got arrested, I could tell people about that stuff, and it would muddy the waters enough that maybe the sexual abuse charges wouldn't stick, or they'd be reduced, or at least the focus would be on corruption instead of child abuse. Webb stood abruptly and left the room. He couldn't bear to look at Chen's face anymore. He couldn't bear to sit in the presence of someone who'd calculated child abuse as a bargaining chip. In an adjacent room, Officer James Kellen sat alone. His public defender had advised him to remain silent, but Kellen wasn't listening. He was staring at his hands, watching them shake, watching them betray him the way he'd betrayed everyone else. Webb entered without knocking. Kellen's head came up slowly. "I want my lawyer," he said immediately. "I don't care what you want," Webb replied, his voice steady but dangerous. "I'm not here to interrogate you. I'm here to inform you of what's happening. Officer Chen is cooperating fully. He's detailed 8 victims. He's named other officers involved, and he's explained your role in protecting him." Kellen's face went white. "8 children," Webb continued. "One of them is 4 years old. One of them is 9 years old and has attempted suicide. One of them is 7 and still wets the bed every night because she's so traumatized." "I didn't," Kellen started. "You didn't stop it," Webb interrupted. "Which makes you complicit, in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of God if you believe in that sort of thing." Webb turned to leave, but then he paused at the door. "That little girl, the 4-year-old, she pointed at you in open court. She was terrified, but she was brave. She identified you even though you're not the one who abused her. She identified you because her 4-year-old mind understood that you were part of it, that you let it happen. I hope you think about her face for the rest of your life." 30 minutes later, Prosecutor Patricia Holloway entered the interrogation room where Kellen was being held. She pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch between them. "I'm offering you a deal," she said quietly. "You cooperate fully. You testify against Chen. You testify against the detective who had leverage over you. You help us identify anyone else involved in this network. You provide us with locations of any evidence. You do all of that, and in exchange, I won't seek the death penalty for conspiracy to commit child sexual abuse." Kellen's head came up. "I didn't sexually abuse anyone." "No," Holloway agreed. "But you allowed it to happen. You protected the people who did. In the eyes of the law, that makes you a co-conspirator. You're facing life in prison either way, Officer Kellen. The only question is whether you go down alone or whether you take everyone else with you." She stood and moved toward the door. "You have 24 hours to decide," she said. "After that, the offer expires, and I'm going to prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law." Kellen broke that night. Completely. Utterly. He confessed to everything, to protecting Chen, to covering up incidents, to intimidating a witness who'd started asking questions about why Chen was always disappearing with children. He named other officers who'd suspected something was wrong but had stayed silent out of loyalty or fear. The investigation expanded exponentially. By the end of the week, 6 officers were arrested. By the end of the month, 12. The police department was hemorrhaging credibility, its leadership in shambles, its reputation destroyed. The mayor held a press conference. The city council demanded answers. Federal investigators became involved. The story went national, then international. News crews camped outside the police station. Hashtags trended. Documentary filmmakers began circling. Sarah, watching from her living room, felt a strange emotional cocktail. Justice mixed with rage, relief mixed with trauma, vindication mixed with grief. Emma was in bed, finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in 3 months. Her nightmares had decreased. Dr. Patricia Chen's therapy sessions had helped, but the path to healing would be long. One evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, her daughter reached up and wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck. "Mommy," Emma whispered. "Yes, baby." "Am I still brave?" Sarah pulled back, looking at her daughter's small face in the lamplight. Emma's eyes were serious, searching for confirmation, for reassurance that her bravery hadn't been consumed by the trauma, that she was still more than what had been done to her. "You're braver than anyone I know," Sarah said, and kissed her forehead. "You're braver than all the police officers combined." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer, and closed her eyes. Later that night, sitting alone in her dark living room, Sarah was haunted by a different thought entirely. Detective Webb had told her there were potentially more victims, children whose parents hadn't brought them to the courthouse, whose children hadn't pointed at the right person at the right moment, whose trauma might never be discovered. How many other children were out there, still carrying their secrets, still believing the lies they'd been told, still too afraid to speak? And how many would carry those scars into adulthood, never knowing that they could have been protected if only the system had worked differently? The trial of Officer David Chen lasted 6 weeks. It was brutal and public, every detail splashed across news outlets and social media platforms. Hashtags emerged with alarming frequency: "Justice for Emma," "Police accountability," "Protect our children." Documentary crews circled like vultures. True crime podcasters began recording episodes. The public's faith in law enforcement hit an all-time low. The courthouse became a battleground of emotion. On one side, Chen's defense team, competent lawyers doing their job, though they seemed to do it with visible discomfort. On the other side, Patricia Holloway and her prosecution team, methodical and relentless, building a case that was less about reasonable doubt and more about inevitable guilt. Emma didn't testify. Legally, she didn't have to. Her initial forensic interview statement and Dr. Chen's professionally documented clinical notes were sufficient evidence. But Sarah attended every single day of the trial, sitting in the front row, watching Chen's face as the evidence mounted, watching him finally understand that his secrets had been exposed not by some grand investigation, but by the instincts of a 4-year-old child. The first week of testimony focused on the forensic evidence. Dr. Patricia Chen took the stand and presented her findings with clinical precision. She described Emma's disclosure, the detail and consistency of the child's memory, the absence of coaching or leading questions. She explained how trauma affects a child's ability to articulate experience, and how Emma's fragmented descriptions actually indicated authentic memory rather than fabrication. The defense attorney tried to undermine her. Isn't it possible that the child was influenced by her mother's expectations? No, Dr. Chen said flatly. In fact, the mother initially believed the child's trauma was stress-related to her parents' divorce. The child's disclosure came as a complete surprise to her. There was no framework for coaching. The second week brought in the victims. The first was a girl named Mia, now 15 years old. She'd been 8 when Chen abused her during a school tour. She sat in the witness stand with her mother in the gallery behind her, and her voice was steady as she described the storage room, the manipulation, the threat. "He said if I told anyone, my mother would blame me," Mia testified. "He said mothers always blame the child, that I would be taken away from her, that I would be put in foster care because I was dirty now. The courtroom was silent. Several jurors were openly weeping. The second victim was Jackson, age 11, who'd been 9 during the abuse. His testimony was halting. Filled with shame he intellectually understood wasn't his responsibility, but emotionally couldn't escape. He described being lured with promises of seeing the K-9 units, of getting a special tour that other kids didn't get. "I felt special," Jackson said, his voice breaking. "And then I felt like I'd done something wrong, like I'd asked for it somehow." The third victim was Carmen, age 7, the youngest. She could barely articulate what had happened to her, but her mother testified on her behalf, describing behavioral changes, nightmares, regression, the sudden fear of men in uniform. By the time the fourth victim finished testifying, the emotional weight in the courtroom was almost suffocating. Officer Kellen took the stand as the prosecution's star witness. He was a man watching his own life burn and accepting that he deserved every flame. His voice was hollow, his words mechanical, his affect completely flattened. He described the day he discovered what Chen had done to the first victim. He explained his rationalization, that reporting Chen would destroy the department's reputation, that maybe they could manage the situation internally, that perhaps Chen was just acting out once and could be controlled. "I told him to stop," Kellen testified. "I told him if I caught him again I'd report him, but I never did report him, even when I found out he'd done it again, and again." Patricia Holloway asked him directly, "Why didn't you report Officer Chen?" Kellen was silent for a long moment. His attorney had advised him not to answer, to claim he was invoking his Fifth Amendment right. But Kellen was done hiding. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I prioritized my career over children's safety. Because I told myself that it wasn't my responsibility. Because I was complicit in my own way, and I knew that reporting Chen would mean exposing myself." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: child sexual abuse, production of child sexual abuse material, making terroristic threats, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Chen was sentenced to life without parole. Kellen received a 30-year sentence. Other officers involved in the cover-up received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. One detective, the one who'd had leverage over Kellen, received 12 years and was permanently disbarred from law enforcement. The police department underwent a complete overhaul. The chief resigned. New leadership was brought in from outside the department. Protocols were completely restructured. Oversight committees with community members were established. Body cameras became mandatory. Psychological evaluations for officers became more rigorous. But numbers and sentences and policy changes felt hollow against the reality of what had happened. What mattered was Emma. 3 months into Chen's incarceration, Emma had her first session with Dr. Patricia Chen as her trauma therapist, separate from the forensic interview role she'd played in the investigation. Sarah watched from the waiting room as her daughter, now showing tiny signs of healing, drew pictures and talked about her feelings in the way that children do, expressing emotions through art rather than words. Emma drew a picture of a dark room. Then she drew the same room with a light in the corner. Then she drew herself standing in the light. "That's me being brave," Emma explained to Dr. Chen, pointing at the figure in the light. It would be a long road, maybe a lifetime of processing and healing, but Emma was here. Emma was alive. Emma was beginning to rebuild the sense of safety that had been stolen from her in a storage room beneath a police station. One evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed 6 months after Chen's sentencing, her daughter reached up and wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck with more strength than before. The nightmares had become less frequent. The fear of uniforms had mostly disappeared. Emma was sleeping through the night more often than not. "Mommy," Emma whispered. "Yes, baby. I'm brave like Detective Marcus, right?" Sarah pulled back, looking at her daughter's small face in the lamplight. Emma's eyes were serious, searching for confirmation, not from doubt, but from a child's need to understand her place in the narrative of what had happened. "You're braver than Detective Marcus," Sarah said. "You're braver than anyone I know. Detective Marcus helped catch the bad guys, but you're the one who pointed at them. You're the one who was brave first." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer, and closed her eyes. But as Sarah left the room and sat alone in the darkness of the hallway, she understood that the real battle was just beginning. Healing wasn't measured in court verdicts or prison sentences. It wasn't measured in policy changes or departmental overhauls. It was measured in years of small victories, in nightmares that gradually faded, in therapy sessions where Emma learned to name her feelings, in moments when her daughter could see a police officer without her entire body tensing with fear. Sarah thought about the other families, the families of Mia and Jackson and Carmen and the other victims. She thought about their own battles with trauma and healing. She thought about how each of them was fighting their own private war against the damage that had been done. She thought about the mothers who hadn't been in that courthouse, the children who hadn't been brave enough or lucky enough to speak up, the abuse that might still be happening somewhere else, by someone else, protected by systems that prioritized reputation over safety. The trial had brought justice, yes, but it had also revealed the fragility of that justice, how easily it could have been hidden, how close they'd come to never knowing what had happened in that storage room. And as Sarah sat in the darkness, she made a silent vow to become an advocate, to help other families, to work toward a system where children's safety was never sacrificed for institutional reputation, to ensure that what had happened to Emma would never happen to another child on her watch. 6 months after Chen's sentencing, Detective Marcus Webb stood in his captain's office, his resignation letter centered precisely on the desk between them. The paper was simple, plain white black ink, the words stark and final. Webb had spent weeks writing and rewriting this letter, searching for language that could adequately express what he was feeling. Nothing had felt adequate. His captain, a decent man brought in from another district to clean up the department's mess, looked at the letter for a long moment before reading it. When he finished, he looked up at Webb with an expression of deep weariness. "I can't stay," Webb said simply, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "Every time I put on this uniform, I feel like I'm lying, not just to the public, to myself." His captain nodded slowly. He understood. In the past 6 months, he'd seen good cops leave and seen the hollow spaces they left behind. He'd watched the department hemorrhage credibility and personnel. He'd inherited a catastrophe and was trying to rebuild from rubble. "I understand," the captain said. "For what it's worth, detective, you did the right thing. You're the reason this all came to light." "No," Webb said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "A 4-year-old did the right thing. I just finally caught up with her." Webb left the department with a full pension and a recommendation letter that wouldn't matter because he didn't want to work in law enforcement again. The badge had represented something to him once: justice, service, protection. But he'd learned that the badge could also represent complicity, silence, and institutional preservation at the cost of vulnerable children. He'd been considering what came next for months, and his thoughts kept returning to Emma Mitchell's bravery, to the moment in the courtroom when a frightened 4-year-old had pointed at her abuser and his accomplice, to the understanding that one child's courage had dismantled a network of predators. Webb started a nonprofit organization called Second Chance Protocol. Its mission was comprehensive and ambitious: to train officers in proper procedures for handling child interviews, to establish oversight committees with community members, to create accountability systems that made it harder for predators to hide within police departments, to provide trauma-informed support for victims, to educate the public about recognizing warning signs of abuse. He worked out of a small office in a refurbished warehouse, funded initially by his own savings and supplemented by grants from child protection organizations. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it felt purposeful in a way that policing never had. Sarah Mitchell became his first major donor. She attended a presentation Webb gave at a community center about institutional accountability and approached him afterward with tears in her eyes. "I want to help," she said. "I want to make sure no other family goes through what we did." Within 6 months, Sarah had joined the board of Second Chance Protocol. Within a year, she was the organization's vice director, using her experience as a mother of a survivor to inform policy and practice. Other survivors of Chen and his associates came forward once it became clear there would be no retaliation, no threats, no institutional cover-ups designed to protect the department's reputation. One by one, their stories emerged. 8 children total, 8 lives disrupted, 8 families changed forever. But something shifted in the public narrative too. The media, which had initially focused on the scandal and the corruption with a sensationalistic lens, began to highlight Emma's role in exposing it all. Not in an exploitative way, but in a way that acknowledged the truth. A child's bravery had toppled a corruption ring and protected countless others. News outlets ran stories titled "The Girl Who Changed Everything," and "One Child's Courage Dismantled a Network." Emma's photo appeared in newspapers and on television screens. Well-meaning advocacy groups wanted to use her image in campaigns. Sarah carefully protected her daughter from exploitation while acknowledging the importance of Emma's story. She agreed to limited media appearances, always with Emma present, always with the understanding that the focus remained on accountability and prevention, not on sensationalism or victimization. When Emma turned 5, a local children's book author named Margaret Chen approached Sarah about writing a story inspired by Emma's experience. Margaret had written several books about difficult topics for children, always with sensitivity and age-appropriateness. She proposed a book about a brave girl who helped catch the bad guys by telling the truth. "It's not about the abuse," Margaret explained in her initial meeting with Sarah. "It's about the courage it takes to speak up, about how a child's voice matters, about how telling the truth, even when you're scared, can change the world." Sarah agreed. The resulting book, Emma's Courage, became a bestseller. It was adopted by schools as part of their child safety curriculum. It was translated into 15 languages. Proceeds went directly to Second Chance Protocol, generating over $2 million in funding. At the book launch event held at a bookstore in downtown, Emma was asked to say a few words. She was nervous. Her small hands trembled as she gripped the microphone, which had been specially lowered to accommodate her height. Sarah stood nearby, ready to intervene if Emma became overwhelmed. But when Emma looked out at the audience, at other survivors of abuse sitting quietly and listening, at advocates and teachers and parents who'd come to show support, at Detective Webb standing in the back with his arms crossed and tears streaming down his face, she found her voice. "I was scared," Emma said simply, her words carrying through the microphone and the small bookstore. "But Mommy said that being scared and being brave is the same thing, because being brave means doing something even when you're scared." She paused, looking down at the book in her hands, the book with her story illustrated on the cover, simplified and age-appropriate but true. "The bad men hurt me," Emma continued, and Sarah's hand moved to her chest. "But they can't hurt anyone else now because I was brave, and you can be brave too. If something bad happens to you, you can tell someone, and the brave people will help you." The audience erupted in applause. Several people were openly weeping. Sarah pulled Emma away from the microphone and held her daughter close, feeling the small body trembling with the effort of speaking so publicly about something so painful. Later that night, after the event was over and they'd returned home, Sarah tucked Emma into bed. Her daughter was exhausted, emotionally wrung out, but also proud of herself. She'd done something difficult. She'd used her voice. "Mommy," Emma asked as Sarah was leaving the room. "Yes, baby. Did I help other kids today?" Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed and took her daughter's small hand. "Yes, sweetheart, you helped a lot of kids by showing them that they can be brave too." Emma nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Later that night, as Sarah sat alone in her living room, she thought about the journey they'd been on. From that moment in the courthouse when Emma had pointed at Kellen, through the interviews and the trials and the media attention, through the therapy sessions and the nightmares that had gradually faded, through watching her daughter transform from a traumatized child into a young advocate. The healing was ongoing. Emma still saw Dr. Patricia Chen regularly, though the sessions had become less about processing trauma and more about building resilience and coping skills. Emma still had occasional nightmares. She was still cautious with men she didn't know. She was still learning to trust again. But she was learning. She was healing. She was thriving in ways that Sarah had feared might never be possible. Second Chance Protocol had expanded. They'd trained over 500 police officers in trauma-informed interviewing techniques. They'd established community oversight committees in 12 different police departments. They'd provided counseling to 43 survivors of institutional abuse. They'd worked with state legislators to pass new laws requiring mandatory reporting and removing statutes of limitations on child sexual abuse cases. The work was never finished. The cases kept coming. The stories of abuse kept surfacing. But now there was a system in place to respond with care and accountability rather than denial and cover-up. Detective Webb, now the full-time director of Second Chance Protocol, had found a new kind of purpose. He worked with survivors, trained officers, testified before legislative committees, and spoke at conferences about institutional accountability. But his proudest moment came on a Tuesday afternoon when Emma asked him if she could help at the office. At 5 years old, she was far too young to do meaningful work, but Webb set her up at a small desk with markers and paper, and Emma spent an afternoon drawing pictures of brave girls and happy endings. Those drawings, taped to the walls of Second Chance Protocol's office, became a reminder to everyone who walked through those doors of why the work mattered, not in the abstract, but in the concrete reality of a child who'd survived, who'd healed, and who was determined to help others do the same. 2 years after Emma pointed at Officer Kellen in the courtroom, Sarah sat in a coffee shop waiting for someone she never thought she'd meet. The person was late, and Sarah was nervous in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the complexity of forgiveness and accountability. Finally, a woman walked in, late 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and a haunted expression etched into the lines of her face. She wore minimal makeup and clothes that suggested someone who'd stopped caring about appearance as a form of protection. This was Officer David Chen's mother, Margaret Chen, no relation to Dr. Patricia Chen or the children's book author Margaret Chen, a coincidence that had confused everyone at first. Margaret Chen approached Sarah's table hesitantly, moving like someone who'd aged a decade in 2 years. She'd been reaching out through intermediaries for months, asking for a meeting. Sarah had resisted at first. The desire to protect Emma from anything even tangentially connected to her abuser had been strong. But something in the letters Margaret had written had seemed genuine. Something in her words had suggested a mother grappling with the terrible reality of what her son had become. "Mrs. Mitchell," Margaret asked, her voice tentative. "Sarah is fine," Sarah replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Please sit." They sat in awkward silence for a moment. The coffee shop was busy with the mid-afternoon crowd, students, remote workers, people conducting business or pleasure. No one paid attention to these two women at a corner table. "I wanted to see you," Margaret began, her voice shaking. "I wanted to ask your forgiveness for what my son did, for who I raised him to be." Sarah didn't know what to say. Forgiveness wasn't hers to give or withhold. That belonged to Emma, and Emma was still learning what that word meant in the context of her trauma. "I've been in therapy," Margaret continued, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup she hadn't ordered, "trying to understand how I missed the signs, how I raised a child who could do such terrible things, how I could have been so blind to who he was becoming." She looked up at Sarah, and there were tears streaming down her face. "I came to tell you that I've donated my life savings to Second Chance Protocol," Margaret said. "Not for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. But because I failed to see the darkness in my son. I failed to ask the hard questions. I failed every single family he hurt." She stood to leave, reaching for her purse, but Sarah reached out and caught her hand. "Failing to see the darkness in someone doesn't make you complicit," Sarah said quietly, speaking from a place of hard-won understanding. "But choosing to acknowledge it, to take responsibility, to try to help others, that takes courage. My daughter taught me that." Margaret Chen left tears on Sarah's table. Meanwhile, Emma was thriving in kindergarten in ways that Sarah had once feared might never be possible. Her nightmares had decreased significantly, down from several times a week to perhaps once a month. She still saw Dr. Patricia Chen weekly, but the sessions were becoming lighter, more focused on building resilience and coping skills than processing trauma. Emma had a best friend, a girl named Lily whose mother had become one of Sarah's closest friends. They'd bonded over their shared experience of having children in the same kindergarten class, but more deeply over their commitment to child protection work. Emma was learning to read. She loved drawing and had recently discovered a passion for building things with blocks. But Emma was also learning something else, that her voice mattered, that speaking up, even when it was scary, could change the world, that she wasn't defined by what had been done to her, but rather by how she'd responded to it. At Second Chance Protocol's annual gala, held 2 years after Chen's sentencing, Emma was introduced as the organization's honorary courage ambassador. She didn't fully understand what that title meant. She was 6 years old, after all, and the concept of institutional symbolism was well beyond her developmental stage. But she understood that the work people were doing at the organization was important, and she understood that somehow, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, she'd helped. Detective Marcus Webb, who'd become like family to Sarah and Emma, appearing at birthday parties and school events, taking Emma to get ice cream on difficult days, stood to give a speech at the gala. The ballroom was filled with police officers who'd completed Second Chance Protocol training, with survivors and their families, with advocates and legislators and community members who believed that institutional accountability mattered. Webb talked about corruption and complicity. He talked about the systems that failed children. He talked about the officers in the room who'd chosen to do better, to be better, to prioritize child safety over departmental reputation. But most importantly, he talked about the power of one person, one young person, to stand up and point toward the truth. Emma didn't do anything extraordinary, Webb said, looking directly at the 6-year-old sitting in the front row, swinging her legs because her feet didn't touch the ground. She did something simple. She told the truth, and that changed everything. Emma leaned against her mother, watching the grown-ups celebrate something she'd done. She didn't fully comprehend the weight of what had happened. Childhood had a mercy in that, the ability to move forward, to heal, to be more than just your trauma. Emma was learning to integrate what had happened to her into her larger story without letting it become the entirety of her identity. Sarah, holding her daughter, thought about the moment in the courtroom. That single moment when Emma pointed. She thought about how fragile justice was, how easily the truth could be buried, how one small act of bravery could unravel decades of secrets. She thought about the other families who'd been broken by Chen. She thought about the families that had been spared because Emma had been there, had been brave, had pointed. Life wasn't fair. Trauma wasn't fair. Abuse was a violence that echoed through time, rippling outward in ways that were impossible to fully contain or control. But this moment, this healing, this justice, this advocacy, this was real too. This was the counterforce that balanced the darkness. That night, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, her daughter asked, "Mommy, am I still brave?" Sarah kissed her forehead. "You'll always be brave, even when you don't feel brave, even when you're scared, even when you're just doing ordinary things like going to school or drawing pictures or playing with Lily. That's what brave is." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer, and closed her eyes. And as Sarah watched her daughter sleep, peaceful and safe in the darkness of her bedroom, she made a silent vow to protect her, to believe her, to never let anyone silence her voice again, to continue the work of second chance protocol until systems changed enough that children like Emma would never have to be brave in the way she'd been forced to be brave. Because in a world that tried to silence children, that tried to hide the darkness, that tried to protect the powerful, that prioritized institutional reputation over vulnerable lives, a mother's love and a child's courage were the fiercest weapons of all.